The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. Carl Sagan.
Welcome to the Lessons from Nature podcast, modeling the secrets of the bees. Hosted by Mark Rubin.
If you hear my voice, you're alive. And if you're alive, you've been cooperating with other people in your habitat. This means you must be part of a tribe of people who cooperate, that trade and share resources. Today on the Lessons from Nature podcast, we'll be discussing Secret 19 from Honey is Money. Cooperating costs less than fighting. It's about the idea that since there's enough honey for everyone, it makes sense to invest in weapons of peace more than weapons of war. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Dr. Jamie Saris. Jamie is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, Maynooth University. He holds advanced degrees in social cultural anthropology from the University of Chicago with an MA and PhD. He has completed a postdoctoral fellowship in clinically relevant medical anthropology in the Department of Social Medicine, Harvard Medical School. Jamie will co-host 4 of the Lessons from Nature podcast episodes with me, where we will discuss the anthropological secrets of the bees through the lens of the human business of making money and the bee business of making honey. Welcome, Jamie. It's great to have you back on the Lessons from Nature podcast.
Great to see you again, Mark.
So today, Jamie, we are going to be talking about a very important chapter in Honey is Money. Back in 1985, when I was thinking about doing this eco project, I read a book by Buckminster Fuller called Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth and another book of his called Critical Path. And these books gave me some ideas about optimal resource allocation and models that relate, global consumption of things with global production of things at a big scale. Like how many chickens do the human beings eat per second, or like things like that, like Buckminster Fuller style of keeping track of things. And this got me thinking about the way we operate the planet. And one of the things that Bucky said in his books was that if the USA invested 90% of the money that we invest in war on peace, and we did that for 5 years, if I remember right, it was a long time ago, but I think it was 5 years if we did this, that the number of people on the planet that we could feed would be 100 billion people. At the time, there were 5 billion people on the planet, and there were 500,000 of them were starving. And I just thought, that really struck me in 1985 of like something was like, if we could feed 100 billion people and we have, 500,000 people starving, then this is a problem that can be solved. Like the gap is big if we invested in these, in weapons of peace is what I'm calling it, weapons of peace. So what I want to say as relates to this episode is that war is more expensive than peace. It makes sense, I think, that from, if nothing else, an economic perspective, that it would make sense to invest in pursuing peace because it's a net cost savings. But sadly, it seems like war is more common than peace with our species over long periods of time. I want to look at the topics we're going to be discussing through the lenses of weapons of peace, which would be things like abundant clean energy, abundant clean water, abundant clean air, clean land, clean food, universal education all around the planet, science, healthcare, disease prevention, food production, battery storage, all the stuff that if we did, we wouldn't need to fight over these resources that keep the populations alive. And so given everything that's happening in the world, let's focus this episode on human behaviors related to increasing cooperation through peace. In Honey is Money, there's a line in this chapter that says, investing in survival costs honey now, today. And as this relates to human civilization, investing in immediate needs can be costly, but it's necessary to survival. And it relates to how humans invest in things like healthcare, infrastructure, and energy production. How do anthropologists see the trade-off between immediate resource allocation and long-term survival in human societies? And I'll clarify it more. Is there any evidence that human beings make long-term decisions about their immediate needs versus future needs? And how can we expand on that for longer periods of time?
There's evidence that humans do both. You can see certain examples that humans seem to always and everywhere have a pretty heavy footprint on their ecosystem. I think, we mentioned this last time, I believe, that the vast majority of the large animals that have survived with humans co-evolved with us, with hominids in Africa. And if you look at ecosystems where, especially H. sapiens sapiens came in, and, the New World is an obvious one, within 10,000 years, that entire ecosystem that took some millions of years to develop in North America had substantially altered. I mean, most of the large animals have been hunted out. Now, climate change might have assisted in that process, but it's remarkable how rapidly that changed. So, the antique bison, the American horse, the American lion, all of those creatures that if you ever get a chance to go to Los Angeles and revisit the Page Museum, which is the La Brea tar pits, you can see examples of them. On the other hand, you also have examples of quite long-term planning. Famously, I think it was in Oxford, they needed to replace in the chapel the major oak beam. The building had been built, I think, 400 years ago. And, someone had planted an oak, that was at the right maturation and the right height and everything else, so they could get, a support beam of the correct size to put it in. So, I mean, we're temporal beings, and how we think through what you might say consequences is really highly dependent on time and place.
Yeah, and it's an interesting balance. I think there's many more examples of short-term thinking than long-term thinking.
You're probably right. I think what happens is that people forget that there was long-term thinking. I mean, famously, when the Fukushima reactor, the disaster with the tsunami, as people were running up the mountain, to escape the wave, they passed a standing stone that had been, I think, again, it was about 1,000 years before, where there was another tsunami. It said the water got up to this high. And people knew it was there. It's often that we don't take the warnings seriously. That problem of the science of consequences is, I think, probably the most pressing one, on our plate right now. And, modern society is not doing a particularly good job of it.
The science of consequences. I think that should be taught in like first grade. I think it is, but it's only like about like lunch money, and like it should be. We should continue the education of those ideas, because everything we do has a ripple effect in the
Absolutely.
future. Well, that actually brings me to a line in the chapter. It says, "The lifespans of our future bees is shrinking every day. We must collect the honey in the most harmonious way." And something about the queen bees. A queen bee lives 20 generations of a regular worker bee, which is the human equivalent of 1,500 years.
Yeah.
And the queen can't leave her house, called the hive. And she relies on the worker bees to bring her energy so she can survive multiple generations. And in that way of thinking, the queen bee is planning for her survival by extending the lifespan of her babies, basically keeping her DNA alive while she's alive so they can keep her alive for longer. So here's the question. How do human societies typically address concerns about the shrinking quality of life or the shrinking lifespan of future generations? And a follow-up question about declining birth rates. Is declining birth rates and population collapse a concern?
I mean, those two are really related. For the most part, lifespans are still increasing. We're seeing the increase in places where we don't usually expect to see older people. Societies of South Africa, Southeast Asia, that were historically poor places in that post-World War II development discourse, have rapidly expanding lifespans and, thus populations of older people. But where you see lifespans flattening or shrinking is precisely where you see some of those problematic regions of the world, of their failing society. So Russia right now, depending upon how you squint, has a lifespan in its early 60s, which is equivalent or getting very close to where Tanzania is right now. that is where you tend to see localized forms of instability. It's usually associated with very, very bad inequalities and effectively a level of hopelessness in society that's generally marked by, what sociologists would call anomic behavior, particularly in Russia's case, alcoholism, which is a massive, massive issue. So there's that problem there. And then the declining birth rates historically are a story of success.
Yeah.
And so, the question about there's a sort of a strange demography is destiny, folks who, imagine populations have the same logic as cancer cells do, which is to constantly keep a pyramidal structure. But of course, as you become more successful, you're simply making this massive pillar that's going to widen out. So you're going to guarantee to get to the edge of whatever the resource capacity, is. Most people estimate that we will probably peak near 10 billion in this century, and you'll start to see relatively rapid declines going, by the beginning of the next century, we could be where we are now and rapidly shrinking. Now, I don't think those numbers are going to shrink forever. That question about whether we'll be able to manage it, both the places of relative declining, population health indices with life expectancy being like one of the primary ones, and a shrinking birth rate, is really going to be a question of how we deal with inequalities. That's what drives environmental issues. That's what drives social, or most of the social pathologies that we talk about. It is one of the worst aspects of human society, or when a human society moves in that direction, it tends to throw off all of the worst signals that humans are capable of producing.
Let's define the weapons of peace now that we're talking. Is a weapon of peace is a weapon that increases equality
decreases equality and increases access, or you might put it another way, decreases exclusion. Whether that exclusion is based on class, whether that's based on gender, whether it's based on lifestyle, that sense of inclusion has to reach those interstices between the classic sociological categories, that people vary. I'm not crazy about a lot of the panic discourse around it, about the so-called crisis of masculinity, but any society produces vast swathes of alienated young men at its own peril. Parts of that alienation is a sense of, can you see something ahead of you? Something good ahead of you, which is not built into the economy. You can maximize the economy and make it very alienating for 98% of the people. It's in the society. But we're not like the hive of the bees. We're in that sort of weird, uncanny gap between being social, obligate social creatures who imagine that they're only functionally social. And that comes to this, the final and probably the darkest little chest that we can open on this question is, war is social.
Yeah.
War is the most highly social activity that humans have. War is indeed so social that pacifist philosophers like William James spent a lot of time thinking about how you could take the good parts of war without the destruction. The good parts of war are about the selflessness, the sense of common purpose. So William James had a very famous phrase, the moral equivalent of war. This would be like moral crusades to make sure that infant mortality doesn't happen. It could be misguided. I think, certainly the temperance movement, I guess that was a kind of moral crusade. But that James was, constantly searching for some sort of way of reining in centripetal American kind of forces. And he saw war as being extremely useful for that, but of course was appalled by its consequences. So he was, very much against the Spanish-American War, and but like, could you take the good parts of that? And if you look at American society, we talked about this, that the armed forces were the harbinger of fundamental changes in American society, from racial equality and gender equality, because like the army doesn't care, right? The army wants you to do, the army is self-consciously a hive mind.
Yes.
It's a created hive mind. So like all of the stuff in the society, gets burned away, and that's very attractive at different times to social reformers. So we struggle with that, in American society in particular, but it recognizes something kind of fundamental, that not all social aspects of human beings are sweetness and light. We're almost, you can make a case, most social in certain kind of darker situations. And I would say in worship and in war, two parts of the human kind of thing that really quite freak me out, but I, recognize them as being central parts of how humanity actually developed.
That's really the tribal components of religion and war and belief and fighting for things that are important. So I'll define a weapon of peace now. I'm going to keep modifying as we go, as I learn from you, is a tool that can be invested in that increases equality and access to resources. And second, creates an optimistic view of the future, a shared future together, and also organizes people around the pursuit of an objective or goal, like a war, but a war that could be a war for something that does something good.
Yeah, a common good.
A common good.
One of the great difficulties of kind of success is that it's good in the sense that it puts everybody on another level, but you're seeing, you can forget that this was a created situation. The fact that you can't imagine your child dying in infancy is not natural. That is a non-natural human intervention in nature. Okay, up to and including making a virus and hopefully other viruses extinct in the wild, like smallpox. But that's 2 generations and all it took, not really that long, 70 years, that you have millions of Americans who are far more terrified of vaccines than they are of infectious diseases.
Yeah. I've observed that people are more afraid of invisible danger than visible harm. And a good example, there's many good examples of that. But for example, I know someone who doesn't like microwave ovens because they're afraid of microwaves. However, so they don't have one. However, they listen to Bluetooth earbuds in their ear, which is microwaves, and also have Wi-Fi throughout their house, and also enjoy the occasional cigarette and drink of alcohol from time to time, which are proven to be harmful. And I think that goes back to the tribal discussion we had before about things people are afraid of commonly, and being in groups of other people that share the same fears as a herd behavior. Because when you're surrounded by people that are afraid of the same things, it's safer. It's safer because they'll sense them either maybe at the perimeter, like before you, and maybe let you know that the danger is coming. But whether the danger is rational or logical or reasonable or based on reality is not relevant to these behaviors. And I think that gets us into trouble.
But historically, again, that was the dream of the Enlightenment, and which was, a part of the American dream, that you would establish as part of a rational democratic culture that was in its function, if not necessarily its commitment, secular, that you could establish shared truths. So if you look over the various Clean Air Acts, the final one of which was passed in the Nixon administration, there was like 16 years or 15 years of acts, all bipartisan. And while there were debates and people voted against it, they were on at least quasi-rational grounds. Well, this is going to cost money, and it might make American cars uncompetitive vis-a-vis, even though the Japanese were rapidly adopting this technology, like catalytic converters, and but it was never that there's no such thing as air pollution. There's a shared ontology that people could debate about. I think that part has largely been lost in the U.S. right now. I think it's very, very hard to come up with a shared objective reality that we might quibble about the edges, but say, yeah, we need to do something about this right here.
There's a line in Honey is Money, cooperating costs less than fighting. He goes, if the flowers move too far away to keep our bees alive, we'll have to pack the best we can and swarm to another hive. And this is about migration and mass migration. The bees swarm when they need more room for some other reason. They leave in mass. And humans do the same. And I have noticed on the planet Earth that there are cities that are underwater. I have seen pictures of them and maybe seen a couple. And so it exists. So let's so I'm going to try to do this from like the naysayer's perspective.
Yeah.
Throughout history in the world, there have been cities that used to be above the water and that are now below the water. I think that's indisputable that this is true. Now, humans like to build cities on the edges of the water because it's pretty. And also there's good access to shipping and transportation and stuff. So it makes sense for a while. However, in the US, there's many parts of the country that are 1 or 2 feet above sea level. And so I'm just going to pick the US as an example. Now, someone living in Holland, I think would agree that designing around the expected height of water and having contingencies for reducing the water when necessary through various circumstances and planning for this variability would be a good idea. But to people that live in like Miami, maybe the idea that like the 1 foot above sea level will be there forever could be a thought in their mind. As the planet warms up and the intensity of storms increase, and I read that for every 1 degree centigrade that the Earth warms up, there's 10% more water in the air. That would mean to me, just based on the reality of other cities being underwater, number one, number two, that we build close to the oceans, and number three, there's going to be more destructive storms and higher water there first, that we'll have to evacuate cities at some point, and there'll be mass migrations of human beings because it will be too expensive to rebuild every 15 minutes.
Sure.
So, in your understanding of the world, when there's a mass migration of any species, and also including humans, do you believe that will be a peaceful and cooperative process? Or do you believe that this would maybe cause, war?
Well, I think we've already seen mass migration. I mean, that is the quote unquote migration crisis. And that migration is happening, and different countries are dealing with it, in different ways, most of them problematic. I tend to think it's the exception that one day you have a normal city and the other day it's underwater. The next day it's underwater. So you're going to see a kind of movement out of places like Florida. In the peculiarly American way, it's the market that's driving that, because certain places are simply going to be uninsurable.
That's right.
And that is already happening right now. I mean, if the Dutch had left it up to insurance companies to reclaim land and maintain the dikes and everything else, I mean, there'd be about 40% of Holland, and it would be infinitely poor. But the Dutch do large capital projects extremely well because, historically the price of failure was the sea rushing in. So you got a certain kind of logic there. I think the United States is going to have to think through some of those processes, a mature understanding that this is going to happen. 10 years is going to come from now. And I think that's part of the culture in some places that has become harder to talk to people. Things are not going to be the same forever.
Well, I think that really is one of the elements of a weapon of peace, is understanding our temporary nature in space and time, and that people will live after us. There's a line on my website, it's not our planet, it's just our turn. I think it's important as a weapon of peace to really start with the basis that life is transient and other people will come later, other living things will come later.
Sure.
And that brings us to the last question of today, which is the perfect way to end this one. There's a line in the book. It says, the purpose of this council is to share our honey debt. And what happened is all the queen bees from the local habitat came together to the Council of the Queens, and they realized they racked up so much honey debt that they're making bad decisions, and that's going to lead to a fight. So they want to share the debt and then together cooperate. And so the question is about shared governance and collaborative responsibility in managing resources and debts can exist in human societies. And when I say debt, I even mean like our carbon debt is an example of that. And so here's the question. How do you view the role of shared governments and collective responsibility across different human cultures, and what could be done to improve that?
At one time, we were quite hopeful that international organizations could do that. And, again, I think it's easy to get depressed about it, but, the relative successes that were enjoyed, in the 50s and 60s, for some of these purposes, the law of the sea isn't a terrible example that there isn't one enforcement arm for the law of the sea, but, countries largely, not all, but largely run those laws because they're seen to be in everybody's interest. Even if you are an inland state, you're going to rely on a port somewhere. I can imagine we might be able to do something like that, on our carbon debt, or at least our carbon crisis, if we had a couple more rational governments, bigger governments. Because I think, many smaller states, whatever they say, are becoming aware that things are changing dramatically. And if there was some kind of equitably shared burden, but that is serious questions about who has power and who's willing to share it. And the history of humans is that people with power only share power when they're worried about something bad happening to them. If you look at the massive changes, let's say, in European and American societies post-World War I and post-World War II, like Britain, for example, the 1914 election, or sorry, the 1912 election had the most restrictive franchise in Europe. Practically nobody could vote. In the 1920 election, it had the most liberal franchise in Europe. Now, did the British ruling class suddenly become enlightened? Did they say, hey, we've been like complete bastards since William the Conqueror in 1066, and I think it's about time, nearly 850 years later, that we're going to... No, several tens of millions of men, working class men, trained in arms and were used to command structures, went back all at once. And, it's like, we're not going to be able to do business as usual. That there might still be some forelock tugging and everything else, but you thought you have a stake in the society. War, as Thucydides says, is the father of many things. And one of the things its birth is after war. Things don't go back to being different. I would like that kind of moment to happen without the crisis of war. This idea about cooperating is, ultimately, these kind of structures are going to have to be there. I think anybody with two brain cells firing. And so it's in everybody's interest to hasten the moment of those structures. But I firmly believe, and this is again the fact that humans live in the symbolic order, not the real world, there are people who are more attached to their profits than they're attached to life itself. And I think it's the race between that and kind of what everybody knows. And which one of those wins is going to be whether we're going to be pessimistic or optimistic about the next 30 or 40 years.
That was really well said. It was a great story to explain it. I'm going to end with one observation of that, is that if human beings can agree about the rules on the seas as we're moving objects around, of what is okay and what's not, I believe there's an opportunity for us to agree on what happens on our spaceship called Earth as we move through space, because we're moving together. We're on one ship. It's called Earth. We're moving through space. And if I pollute one part of my spaceship, it goes into the entire spaceship. Okay. And it's not hard to grasp the idea that we're all connected together on this rock. And it would be better to cooperate and invest in weapons of peace.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I thought you did a very good expansion on Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot. I mean, that's I think every kid should learn that little speech that was in Cosmos. Everybody you ever loved and everybody you ever hated, everything you ever heard about is on that thing. So if you have an enemy, really forgive him because, there's nothing like this anywhere else in the universe. Even the people who annoy you are almost in this sort of weird, unique kind of thing. So I always thought that it was a call to a sort of species consciousness that, I would like to inculcate in children much earlier.
Me too. And this project's based on three people: Carl Sagan, Buckminster Fuller, and Stalking Wolf, who was a guy I learned from Tom Brown Jr. And he was an Apache scout. The project is based on those three philosophies. The space and time stuff and our placement in the universe is from Carl Sagan. Resource allocation and optimization is Buckminster Fuller. And planning for 7 generations ahead, 500 years, is from Stalking Wolf. And basically, those are the three influences in the Venn diagram of this project. All living things that cooperate follow principles of anthropology. If you did any work today to make money, the success of your work required cooperation from at least one other person, and maybe that person paid you. It would be wise to scale up cooperating across our entire species with all living things. After all, cooperating costs less than fighting, so investing in getting along makes a lot of bee sense. If you enjoyed this discussion about anthropology and the way bees and people are similar, subscribe to the Lessons from Nature podcast, where we're modeling the secrets of the bees. On the next episode of the Anthropology series, Jamie and I will discuss the idea that most things cost more later, so it makes sense in solving problems now. Visit projecthoneylight.life for more information about living in harmony with the rest of nature. Thanks a lot for watching this.